So I have a couple boards here that I want to glue up into a panel, and they're all flattened and squared up, and I've got a really good quality joiner, and I have adjusted this fence to as close to 90 degrees as I can get it, which means that if both of these edges are nice and square, they're going to glue up and have a really flat glue up. Even with that in mind, I'm not going to trust that. I want to take an extra precaution so that if there's, for some reason, this is slightly off of 90 and even a fraction of a degree, will translate into some boards that aren't coming together flat, which is going to translate into a lot of headaches when it comes to flattening those boards out. So what I want to do is I want to take into account which faces are against the fence or away from the fence as I'm rejointing these edges. I'll explain that in just a minute, but the first thing I want to do is figure out how my two boards are living within the panel. So I can kind of take a look, and if I like the way everything is looking visually with the grain direction, these are the way my boards are going to live. I'm going to go ahead and put a cabinet maker's triangle across those boards. This locks their position into the panel, so I know what's up, what's down, what edges are touching, and what edges are away from each other. So the mating edges, where the boards come together, those are the critical edges. Ideally, they're square. Even if they're not square, I want to joint in such a way that I'm going to end up with a flat glue up. What that means is that one of these faces is going to be against the fence, the other face is going to be away from the fence as I'm jointing. So I tend to make a mark. I can put an O on one edge for outside, and I'll put an I on the other edge, and that will be run toward the inside of the fence. And what I would like to do, just to kind of show you how powerful of a strategy this is, I want to intentionally kick the fence out of 90 by a few degrees, so it's really going to be evident that they're off angle, and that if we don't pay attention, we're going to end up with a panel which is pretty far off from flat. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and joint each edge, keeping my marks against the fence. And then we'll take a look and see how that translates into our panel. So I've got my board with the eye. This is going to go against the fence. While I'm jointing the edge, I'm keeping pressure against the fence. As I move to the outfeed table, I'm registering all of my pressure against the fence there, also down against the outfeed table to ensure a nice flat cut. One drawback with this technique is you may find yourself jointing against the grain on one of the boards. On this Grizzly jointer outfitted with segmented cutter heads, it's not an issue because I get a clean cut going either way. On a joiner with straight knives, I'll take a look at the boards and run the board with the steepest grain in the correct direction. On the other board, I'll just slow down the feed rate to minimize any potential tear out. Okay, I'm going to flip one of these boards over, and I'm going to throw some tape across that joint to keep it nice and tight on this face. And that way I can flip it over. And we have a pretty big gap on the other side, and if we were to clamp that together, we can see how that's quite a bit out of flat. We have a lot of material to move there. Conversely, if we match up our triangles and we kept our faces correctly against the fence or away from the fence, going off of our marks, we're going to end up with a panel where even though the glue joint is going to be slightly off of parallel, they're going to cancel each other out, and we're still going to end up with a flat glue up. So as much as we want to shoot for square on the jointer, I also want to plan for not being exactly square. So I'm always keeping track of my reference faces whenever I'm jointing, which means that I'm always starting by getting my boards lined up, Could be a 2-board, 3-board, 4-board glue up. I go through the whole process. I figure out what I want my panel to look like, and I'll mark each joint with an I and an O, and that'll help guide my jointing so we end up with a good glue up. So with this in mind, we should be able to go to the workbench, throw some clamps on there, and have a nice flat glue up, which means we can keep going on our project without having to do a lot of rehab on an unflat panel. I'm confident I did a pretty good job at the joiner, so we shouldn't have any problems once the boards come together in terms of staying nice and flat. A couple things to keep in mind. One is, how many clamps do I need on something like this? It really depends on how wide your boards are, because the clamping pressure, it radiates out at 45 degrees from wherever the clamp is, which means on a very thin strip of wood we're trying to clamp on, there's almost no width of glue pressure extending out from that clamp, so we need 1,000,000 clamps. On something like this, which is about 8 inches wide, we need far less. So one way to figure that out is I can go ahead and get my combination square, set it to 45 degrees, and come in from an edge, and let's say I need my clamping pressure all the way out to the end of the board. Then I'll flip it around, and there I can see that one clamp is really giving me, roughly 16 inches, in this case, maybe 14 to 16 inches of clamping pressure across that joint. So if I continue that path, so what that tells me is really just 3 clamps is giving me plenty of clamping pressure across that glue joint. I'm going to use 4. I like that. So I think with 4 clamps, even though it may look like we have decent gaps between the clamps because the boards are pretty wide, it's not going to be an issue in terms of applying clamping pressure all the way across that glue joint, which is what I really want to do. So the other thing I want to keep in mind is there's just a slight bow to these boards, maybe a thin 1/16 of an inch. I certainly don't want to just clamp them together and not pay attention to that, because that's going to translate to a lot of material I've got to remove off the surfaces to get nice and flat. So I want to be as strategic as I can when I'm applying clamping pressure in order to see if I can't flatten those boards out a little bit more once we have the clamps in place. Okay. So I know I want to get 4 clamps on here, and what I don't want to do is clamp all 4 clamps from one side or the other, because it can stress that out of square. So because I want to stagger them, I'm going to go ahead and have 1 clamp out toward the end and 1 a little bit more centered. What that's going to allow me to do is get these 2 clamps in place and then come across the top and place the other 2 clamps. So I'm clamping both from above and below. Now the thing is, there's sort of a misconception that if I have uneven clamping pressure and say the boards are slightly bowed under clamping pressure, it's going to stay that way. Actually, the flatness has to do with the way we've treated those edges. So even if we temporarily clamp this and there might be a bow, the idea is that once we remove the clamps, everything's going to be nice and flat. Okay, so I think I'm set. There's a couple different ways to go when we're gluing up something like this, whether we're applying glue to one edge or the other, or 2 edges. I prefer to apply a heavier coat of glue to just one edge because it's faster, and that heavier layer of glue is less likely to skin over before I'm able to get my clamps in place. So a lot of ways to do it, a lot of different brushes and stuff. I like to crook my finger over so that one of my knuckle joints is centered, so that I'm getting a thick layer of glue closer to the center and not quite so heavy on the outside edges. What's really, really important is that I have full coverage all the way across the wood, because the glue doesn't tend to migrate very easily to cover up dry areas. So I'm just double checking But in general, it's just a few seconds to get a line of glue on, as opposed to getting a bead on there and brushing and all kinds of stuff. So just one heavy glue line on there, and I can squish those back and forth a little bit. So I like to start with the clamp closest to the center. And what I want to do is I just want to make sure that the joint is nice and flush. Right as it's centered on that glue line there. So I'm still up a little ways there. So what I can do now is get a clamp. It can be a spring clamp. You don't need a ton of pressure. So I'm just temporarily flattening out that joint at the end. So I'm flat where the clamp is, and I'm flat where the end is. And let's see if we can address the other side here in the same way. So now I can squish those boards until they're level. So that feels pretty good. That still feels pretty good. I'm a little off here. So before I put too much pressure there, I'm going to loosen this. I'm going to get it level where that second clamp is in the center. Hopefully that's going to keep that flush. And I'll keep working my way out to get this. So this is flush again, and I stayed a little bit better here. And now I can get my clamp just along that end. So we took something that was out maybe 1/16 of an inch, and I think right here, maybe we're skinny 1/64 out. So I've got a little bit of work to do, but I certainly did my best to get rid of as much of that bow as possible. That still feels pretty good. Okay. All right, so I'm just tightening the clamps up, making sure I'm getting the clamps on the top and the bottom, pretty equal pressure. And I'm looking for a nice consistent glue line all the way across the joint. That's a really good indicator. Number one, I've got a good amount of glue on there. Number two, I've got even clamping pressure all the way down the line. If I were putting clamps on boards, it might be a little bit narrower, and I noticed areas where I didn't have any squeeze out. I would definitely try to get another clamp out and see if we can get some squeeze out in that area as well. So, not a lot of heavy thinking or hard work. A glue up is a pretty simple thing, but I do think it's important that you get the details right, because then everything else is pretty easy. So it really started by getting our boards milled as flat and square as we could, getting our joiner set up as square as we could, but then really keeping track of those faces that were going either against or away from our joiner fence. So that even if we were off a little bit, we still end up with a glue up which is super flat. Take some care getting your clamps set up. Make sure you have enough in relation to the width of the board, and see if you can just start from the center, get that aligned, and you work your way out to the ends. And basically a card scraper, get the glue off there, flatten it a little bit, and this is nice and flat.